In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser, while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her, despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America. In this new story, archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it Cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the 2-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it. A deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. And then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. In this news story, archived winter case summaries mention an isolated roadside motel where a handful of January incidents reportedly ended with rooms found locked from the inside. None of the events led to confirmed criminal findings, yet each file contained similar details about strange audio interference and abrupt temperature drops moments before contact with occupants was lost. The building still stands near a quiet state route where storms form quickly in midwinter. Elias Trenton, a 36-year-old traveling survey technician, checked into that motel during a frigid January evening after his truck lost traction near a frozen incline. He planned to spend one night there before continuing toward a mountain utility site the next morning. The motel looked worn but serviceable, a flat row of rooms facing a snow-covered parking lot where sodium lights flickered through the cold. He carried two duffel bags, his company tablet, and an old camcorder he used to document cabin inspections when cell reception dropped. The lobby door chimed weakly as he entered. The desk sat empty except for a sign explaining that late arrivals should ring the bell. Before he touched it, a woman emerged from the back room, wrapped in a thick sweater, hair still wet from the snow outside. She checked him in quickly and handed him a key to room 6. She warned him that heavy wind sometimes rattled the doors during storms, which caused guests to think someone knocked when no one stood outside. He nodded politely, then headed back into the cold to unload his gear. The motel hallway felt warmer than the exterior, yet still carried a draft that slipped through gaps near the window frames. He unlocked room 6 and stepped inside. The space smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner mixed with dry heat from the wall unit. A small table stood near the door where he placed his camcorder and notebook. Outside the window, snow drifted past the lights in slow waves. Elias recorded a quick video note for his employer, describing road conditions and slight delays. The camcorder picked up the hum of the heater and occasional rattling from the air vent. He checked the lock twice because the door mechanism felt loose. After settling in, he heated water for a packet of instant noodles and reviewed maps for the next day's assignment. The storm outside intensified until patterns of white spiraled across the glass. He attempted a radio check with a colleague at the ridge station, but heard only static layered with faint, irregular clicks. The storm likely disrupted all nearby channels. He made a note to attempt another call before sleeping. As he prepared to shut off the overhead light, he heard a soft tap at the door. He froze. The tap repeated once, then stopped. He approached carefully and looked through the peephole. Nothing moved outside except snow swirling across the walkway. He waited several minutes before returning to the bed. The heater clicked loudly as it cycled off. The room dimmed under the single lamp beside the table. The camcorder remained on standby, its indicator light reflecting faintly on the wall. He planned to sleep early, yet another sound reached him, a scraping near the bathroom vent. It resembled metal sliding against metal in short, inconsistent strokes. Elias stepped into the bathroom and turned on the light. The vent cover rattled slightly when he tapped it. Cold air drifted out as if the duct connected to an exterior shaft. He bent down to listen more closely. The scraping stopped. The sudden silence felt sharper than the noise. He adjusted the vent screws with his multi-tool but left the cover in place. When he returned to the main room, he checked the door again. The lock remained secure. Outside, the wind howled across the lot, shaking the walkway railings. He sat on the bed and opened his notebook. Before writing anything, he heard the tap again, this time softer, like something brushing against the metal edge rather than knocking. He whispered, "Who's there?" though he knew the front desk warned him about storm pressure causing false knocks. He turned on the camcorder and aimed it toward the door, placing it on the table. He spoke a brief comment into the microphone about strange noises likely caused by wind. The camera captured the faint draft that moved the curtains slightly. He stepped to the window, but the outside walkway remained empty. At 11:30, the power flickered once. The heater stuttered briefly before restarting. The camcorder remained stable, but its audio began picking up a rhythmic clicking pattern that Elias did not hear with his own ears. He rewound the last few seconds and listened carefully. The clicking repeated at irregular intervals, almost like distant footsteps recorded through interference. He frowned and checked the hallway again through the peephole. Still nothing. He decided to test the lock mechanism to ensure no draft pushed the door. He turned the deadbolt, then pulled lightly on the handle. The door did not budge. As he stepped back, he heard another sound, this time from behind him. A soft sliding noise near the window. When he turned, the curtains swayed slightly, though. No wind entered the room. He approached the window and pressed his hand against the glass. It felt colder than expected, almost icy. A faint vibration traveled through the window frame, which made him step back. The vibration lasted 3 seconds, then faded. He checked outside again, but the walkway lights flickered unpredictably as the storm worsened. Snow pressed hard against the edges of the frame, which explained some of the draft, though the vibration remained unexplained. He returned to the table and faced the camcorder. The indicator light blinked slowly. He reviewed another short segment and noticed brief distortions in the audio that resembled whisper-like tones layered under the clicking. The tones carried no clear words, only rough syllables shaped by interference. He wrote in his notebook that extreme cold sometimes caused metal in older buildings to shift, which created similar patterns. Just after midnight, he sat back on the bed with the lamp off, leaving only the camcorder recording. The heater hummed steadily. The storm outside roared against the walls. The room felt colder despite the warmth coming from the vent. He covered himself with the blanket, but remained alert after the earlier noises. Another tap hit the door, this one louder. He rose slowly and approached, his hand hovering near the handle. Through the peephole, he saw nothing at first. Then he noticed a subtle shadow shift near the railing, not shaped like a person, but more like a piece of wind-blown debris passing close to the light. When he blinked, the shadow vanished entirely. He backed away and checked the camcorder to confirm it captured the sound. The audio spiked at the moment of the tap, followed by a low static rumble that did not match ambient wind. He sat again and listened carefully. A dull thud struck the wall behind the headboard as if something hit the outside siding. The impact did not repeat. Around 12:45, the room temperature dropped sharply. The heater still ran, yet the air felt thin and cold. His breath became visible in the dim light. He stood near the bathroom door and felt an even colder draft slip from the vent. He opened the vent cover slightly and saw nothing inside except darkness. Yet the cold intensified enough to cause a mild ache in his hands. The camcorder captured his movements from across the room. It recorded the moment he approached the vent and the moment he stepped back. It also recorded a faint metallic scrape echoing inside the duct. Elias heard it too this time, a slow, dragging scrape, distant but deliberate. He whispered, "Is someone in there?" Then waited. The scrape stopped instantly. It's courting by sign and his letter in 2022 people, and this stopped and be in the manic, and make from mustable with but these son so and never in percentis time. He closed the vent cover firmly and secured the screws. As he turned toward the main room, he heard soft clicking beneath the carpet near the door. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the floor. The clicking continued in a broken pattern, too slow to be pipes and too rhythmic to be settling wood. It almost resembled a sequence, like metal tapping arranged in a coded repetition. He stepped back and wrote a brief note about the sound. Before he finished the sentence, the power flickered a second time. The lamp shut off completely. Only the dim LED on the camcorder continued glowing. The heater stopped. The room fell silent except for wind outside and the faint click inside the duct. Elias sat near the camcorder so its microphone could capture any continued noise. The LED brightened slightly to compensate for the darkness. Snow pounded against the window so forcefully that the frame creaked. The clicking inside the duct transitioned into a scraping again. It grew slightly louder, then abruptly stopped. A moment later, a new sound echoed from the door. Not a tap, a slow, heavy shift of metal against metal. The deadbolt twisted halfway before stopping. Elias lunged for the handle and locked it again. His breathing sped up as he pressed his weight against the door. The hallway remained silent. Only the wind moved outside. He checked the peephole but saw nothing except the distorted glow of the walkway lights. He stepped back and grabbed his phone even though he had no reception earlier. The screen showed no signal. He powered it off and on again out of habit, but nothing changed. He picked up the camcorder and held it in front of him. The lens caught his anxious breathing and the dim glow from the hallway. He whispered another verbal note, explaining that the deadbolt briefly shifted on its own. As he spoke, a dull thump hit the wall behind him. He spun around but saw nothing. The thump repeated near the window. The curtain fluttered, though the frame remained shut. He approached the window carefully. The frost across the glass formed patterns more severe than before. The center shifted subtly, pulsing outward in rings that looked like breath fogging the other side. He reached forward, ready to wipe the frost with his sleeve. Before he touched the glass, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the room. The camcorder captured the moment the heater vent slammed shut, even though no airflow pushed it. Elias stumbled backward. The crack repeated twice from the bathroom vent. Then silence returned instantly. He grabbed his coat and planned to leave despite the storm. He checked the deadbolt again, but the knob felt warmer than the rest of the door. He twisted the lock. It resisted. He pressed harder. It did not move. The mechanism felt jammed from the inside. He stepped away, gripping the camcorder tightly. The audio feed picked up a faint metallic sequence that sounded like something pulling through narrow tubing. He realized the duct noises no longer came from one direction, but two separate points above him. He backed toward the corner near the bed. The lights flickered once more, though the power remained out. At 1:13, the footage captured the moment Elias's breath clouded heavily beneath the dim LED, thicker than earlier, as if the temperature plunged again. The door rattled once. The window frame vibrated enough to shake the curtain rod. Elias turned the camcorder toward the bathroom just as a final scraping noise echoed through the duct. The recording ended abruptly. The camcorder shut off mid-frame. Staff entered the room the following afternoon after Elias failed to check out. The door remained locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry appeared. The room was undisturbed except for his notebook lying open on the table and faint frost patterns covering the window interior. The temperature inside measured significantly lower than the hallway, even though the heater was functional. His belongings remained untouched. Elias was gone. Investigators found no evidence of intrusion. The camcorder battery drained completely, though the file remained intact. Review teams noted the audio distortions and unusual duct noises, concluding they resulted from storm pressure, faulty ventilation, or electrical fluctuation, though none of those factors aligned perfectly with the sequence captured. Locals still warned travelers about staying in the motel's older rooms during severe January storms. They mentioned the vents carrying strange echoes on the coldest nights and door mechanisms shifting without clear reason. Some former guests claimed to hear tapping from the duct hours before the storm peak, even when no other rooms are occupied. Room 6 remains closed for renovations according to the motel management. Yet people driving past on winter nights sometimes say they see the curtains sway even when no wind touches the windows, as if someone inside still stands near the glass watching the snow drift across the lot. This isolated church has a long history. The historic stone chapel, located on the high ridge of the Northern Valley, remained a silent witness to the local history. A heavy oak door stood in the darkest corner of the eastern transept to protect the original property deeds and maps. This facility was a critical link for the Parish Heritage Board because it provided the only physical evidence for the building. For 70 years, the archive operated without a single major incident until a Friday in November of 2022. On that day, the building recorded a sequence of structural shifts that defied every known engineering model used by the office. Lyle Vance was a 46-year-old historical preservation officer who worked for the regional government during that busy year. His primary job involved reviewing the weekly building reports to ensure the foundations remained stable against the shifting mountain groundwater. Lyle enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the hidden corners of the town buildings. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of ancient stone. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific vibration sensor was experiencing a strange recurring calibration error. The descent took nearly 10 minutes as the air grew colder and the dim lights flickered over the damp walls. Lyle reached the end of the hall and connected his diagnostic tablet to the monitoring port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the data logs were almost full of movement alerts that should have been ignored by the software. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of seismic readings taken during a recent light rain. Lyle decided to download the final batch of sensor data before he cleared the memory and reset the internal hardware. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the event logs to ensure the equipment was anchored. He saw the familiar baseline readings and the small spikes caused by the passing of heavy trucks on the road. One log from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the pressure signature looked different from the data around it. A massive weight had been applied to the internal side of the sealed wall just past the edge of the frame. The sensor recorded a steady push that lasted for exactly 5 minutes before the entire system went dark for a second. Lyle felt a slight chill because that section of the church was known for being a completely dead zone for signals. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the building had shifted again during the night shift. The pressure was still there, but the sensor reading was now pulsing and a low-frequency hum stood near the frequency. The force appeared to be originating from deep beneath the floor, and it was pulling something heavy out from the dark. Lyle zoomed in on the digital waves until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating vibration. He checked the timestamps and realized that the event had been at that specific location for less than 10 minutes total. The third log showed the pressure dropping back to zero and leaving nothing but a flat line in the file. Lyle looked toward the actual wall in the corner and saw that the mortar seal was still perfectly intact today. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished now. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans echoing through the empty corridor. The floor was dry from the recent summer heat, and he noticed thin cracks in the stone where the wall met. He followed the line for about 5 feet until he reached a small gap hidden behind a stack of metal shelves. Lyle found a heavy iron latch tucked under a layer of thick dust and cobwebs that looked intentionally placed long ago. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy bolt was sealed with industrial wax. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the heavy air, and Lyle immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He used his portable radio to contact the main office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious architectural anomaly today. Within an hour, 2 structural engineers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with bright orange plastic tape. They asked Lyle to show them the sensor logs on his tablet so they could identify the source of force. The engineers noted that the hidden hallway did not have a registered blueprint in any of the municipal archive books here. They carefully scraped the wax on the latch and discovered several rusted ventilation pipes from a forgotten early 20th century. The local museum had reported a missing set of original town founding documents 3 months earlier, but the police had nothing. These papers were extremely valuable, and a former clerk had likely hidden them in the wall until the investigation closed now. The engineers realized the thief must have used the old vault room to hide the stolen property behind the wall. They analyzed the sensor data from other units along the foundation to track the path of the subtle structural shifts. This lead eventually took them to a small residential house located 2 blocks over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more documents that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a collector to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former janitor who knew exactly how to access the sub-basement without triggering alarms. He did not realize that the new vibration sensors were set to record every movement regardless of the weight or size. His simple mistake of leaning against the hidden latch had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. Lyle returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details today. Most people would have deleted the error logs without looking at the data because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the thief, and the original deeds were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the municipal buildings and always looked a little closer at the logs from the basements. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The hidden latch still stands in its dark corner and records the passage of time 1 minute at a time now. It sits behind the metal shelves and the occasional staff member who travels through the silence of the lower levels. No one ever suspects that a simple sensor could be the most important witness to a crime in the building. Lyle knows that every data log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look today. He walks the halls with a new perspective and watches the digital monitors for anything else the system catches. The federal investigation into the document theft revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the market. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the property rights of many local families. The recovery of the original land survey maps ensured that several ongoing legal disputes could be settled with accurate evidence. Lyle received a formal commendation from the mayor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire Valley community. He often shares the story of the hidden hallway with new preservation officers as a lesson in professional diligence. The quiet church stands on the hill and continues to serve the families as it has for many generations now. Visitors admire the architecture and the stained glass windows without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the floor. The story of the vibration sensor and the iron latch has become a local legend among the town residents today. Most people walk past the oak door in the transept without realizing its significance in the history of the parish. For Lyle, the sound of the wind against the limestone will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The truth about what happened on that Friday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of the Quiet Valley continue their lives while the mystery of the church hallway hangs over the town. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Lyle continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm today. The silence of the basement is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The archives of the town recorded the passage of time as the seasons changed from the heat of the summer. The limestone walls of the old chapel remained strong against the wind that blew across the high ridge of the mountain. Lyle often looks at the digital feed from the sensors on his tablet while he sits in his quiet office. He knows that the history of the town is safe as long as someone is willing to watch the data. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The structural engineers completed their final report on the hidden corridor and the forgotten vault room in the sub-basement. They found that the original construction had been modified several times during the early part of the 20th century. These changes were never added to the official maps of the town or the blueprints of the historic limestone chapel. This lack of information provided the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to keep a secret in the dark. The discovery of the iron latch was a turning point in the investigation into the missing regional property deeds. The former janitor was arrested and charged with the theft of several state documents that were over 80 years old. He had been planning to move the items to a secondary location when the vibration sensor recorded his presence today. The evidence from the digital logs was a critical part of the case presented by the local district attorney. The community was relieved to know that the history of their homes and lands was once again secure in archives. Lyle continues to perform his duties with a sense of purpose that comes from knowing he made a difference. The story of the isolated church and its hidden history serves as a reminder of the value of the archives. It shows that even the most mundane data can hold the key to solving a mystery from the recent past. The machines that monitor our world are silent witnesses to the actions of the people who move through it. We may not always see the cameras or the sensors, but they are recording the truth 1 second at a time. For the residents of the valley, the stone chapel is more than just a place of quiet reflection now. The preservation of history requires the constant attention of people like Lyle Vance, who value the details of the world. He remains a dedicated officer who understands that the past is a foundation for the future of the quiet town. The record of the hidden hallway is a permanent part of the digital logs stored in the local government office. It will be there for the next generation of technicians to find when they perform their routine maintenance checks. The history of the church is written in the stone and preserved in the silent data of the sensors. This roadside camera captured something nobody noticed. The long and winding stretch of asphalt known as Route 42 cut a lonely path through the dense pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. For miles in every direction, the landscape was dominated by ancient cedar trees and thick undergrowth that swallowed the morning light. A single automated traffic camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a massive state park. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor seasonal weather and road conditions. Local transportation officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant accident or a major storm was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in October of 2021, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of habit who took pride in the technical precision required to keep the remote monitoring network alive. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange, recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours as the elevation climbed and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of trees. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the moisture or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the guardrail. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. It was an odd place to stop because the terrain was steep and there were no trails in sight. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle for help. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and they were pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a dark hooded jacket that obscured their face from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 4 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the pines. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper authorities present at the scene. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any frame. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a sophisticated heist that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the white sedan. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and overgrown weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the transportation department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The state park was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes, the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever in this new story. Archived travel notes from cold region patrols mention a winter road exit where visitors reportedly vanished during heavy storms each January. The incidents share subtle similarities, which led locals to warn travelers about taking that route after dusk. No official conclusion ever linked the area to crime, which kept the road open despite unsettling reports. Clara Haldren, a 34-year-old wildlife survey assistant, drove that road during a mid-January evening as she returned from a remote tracking station. She planned to reach her lodge before nightfall since blizzard warnings suggested dangerous winds by midnight. Her assignment involved recording migration data, which required several hours in snowy terrain. By late afternoon, the sky turned darker than expected, which convinced her to take the faster exit toward the valley. The road narrowed as she approached the turnoff, where a leaning sign barely remained visible through swirling frost. Patches of wind-carved ice stretched across the asphalt, which forced her to slow her truck. She noticed tire marks moving toward the exit, despite local warnings posted on bulletin boards in nearby towns. She had heard stories about sudden whiteouts that formed without warning near the valley, but she never experienced one herself. Clara turned onto the exit, which dipped into a hollow between tall ridges. Snow absorbed nearly all sound, which gave the empty road an unnerving stillness. Her headlights caught glimpses of broken guardrails, which suggested others had struggled with the sharp curves. She breathed slowly while gripping the wheel because something about the air felt heavy. She checked the clock and noted she still had enough time to reach her lodge if the weather held. A faint flash reflected in her side mirror, which made her glance backward. For a moment, she thought she saw another vehicle, but nothing followed her. The hollow deepened until the ridges blocked the last hints of daylight. She continued carefully while her radio crackled with static. She tried adjusting the frequency, but the distortion grew louder until she shut it off to preserve concentration. As she neared the midpoint, she saw an overturned snowmobile lodged against a half-buried mile marker. She stopped her truck and stepped out into wind that bit through her jacket. The vehicle looked recently abandoned, which meant someone had been traveling this route despite community warnings. She called out anyone out here, but her voice faded quickly into the storm-filled air. She examined the snowmobile and found a torn glove caught near the ignition. Fresh footprints trailed away from the scene toward a gap in the ridge. The steps looked uneven, like the person stumbled repeatedly. Clara debated searching farther, but darkness pressed in fast, which made her decide to continue driving and report the discovery later. She returned to her truck, but before she could start the engine, a dull mechanical hum drifted across the hollow. The sound came from deeper along the road, which confused her because there were no structures nearby according to regional survey maps. She started the engine and followed the route slowly until she saw a faint orange light blinking in the distance. The light remained steady as she approached a wide bend where snow piled high along both shoulders. At the bend, she discovered an abandoned road maintenance trailer with its hazard beacon still running. The trailer door hung open while snow drifted inside. Her breath caught as she realized the beacon could not have lasted long in such cold conditions. She approached the trailer and saw scattered tools on the floor, including a cracked radio handset. A notebook lay half buried near the wheel, with entries mentioning repeated signal interference along the exit. As she flipped through the notebook, she found a page describing faint vibrations in the ground during certain storms. The writer mentioned hearing muffled clanks like large metal parts shifting beneath the road. Clara frowned because no underground structures existed in this region except old drainage channels long since collapsed. A sharp gust of wind slammed the trailer door, which made her jump. She returned to her truck and continued driving because the storm intensified rapidly. Snow fell so heavily it appeared as a wall of white ahead of her headlights. She slowed to a crawl and kept both hands tight on the wheel as she followed the faint curve of the asphalt. The ground trembled lightly beneath her, which reminded her of the notebook entry. She dismissed the idea because she believed the wind caused the shaking. A shadow crossed her headlights, which made her hit the brake. A lone figure stood near the shoulder, wearing a winter suit covered with frost. Clara rolled down her window slightly and called, "Do you need help?" But the figure remained motionless. She stepped out cautiously and walked toward them with her flashlight held steady. When she reached the figure, she saw the suit was empty. It hung on a crooked pole that had been planted in the snow. A small handwritten tag on the collar read, "Do not follow the lines." The message unsettled her because it sounded like a warning written in haste. She turned back toward her truck when the ground vibrated again. This time, the tremor felt rhythmic, like machinery running beneath frozen soil. She knelt and placed her hand on the snow, which gave a slight pulse. Her breath quickened as she looked around the hollow, now swallowed by dense, blowing snow. She hurried to her truck, but before she could enter, she heard a deep, metallic shift to the east. The sound carried through the wind like a massive gate sliding along rails. She could not see anything past the storm, but she sensed movement in the valley. She entered the truck and locked the doors while trying to think clearly. Her headlights flickered as if something interfered with the electrical lines. She tapped the dashboard, then noticed faint lights appearing ahead on the road. They flickered irregularly, like small beacons activating in sequence. The lights formed a line that guided toward a narrow pass between the ridges. Clara refused to approach that direction because locals frequently reported strange sightings near that pass. She reversed slowly while trying not to lose traction. The lights brightened briefly, then faded until darkness returned. The vibration beneath her truck continued for several minutes before stopping entirely. She took this brief calm to turn around on the narrow road, which required precise steering due to steep snowbanks. As she maneuvered her truck, the beam of her headlights crossed a collapsed service gate near the slope. She had not seen this gate earlier, which meant either snow covered it before or something triggered a shift that exposed it. She walked closer and found tracks leading inside a shallow service tunnel cut into the ridge. The tracks appeared similar to those from the abandoned snowmobile. She snapped several photos and backed away because the chemical scent of old fuel drifted from the opening. She returned to her truck, hoping to escape before the storm worsened. As she drove upward, the ground vibrated again, though softer this time. She kept her focus on the road until she reached the valley rim, where wind cleared some of the snow. From this angle, she saw faint glimmers below which matched the blinking beacons earlier. She paused briefly because the pattern formed straight lines that cut through the hollow in unnatural alignment. The moment she looked down, a loud clank echoed across the valley, which made her flinch. The beacons vanished instantly, as if someone shut them off in unison. She accelerated toward the main road while gripping the wheel tightly. The exit curved toward safer terrain until she reached an old ranger turnout. She parked beside the shelter and caught her breath. Inside the shelter, she found outdated emergency logs describing similar winter vibrations recorded years earlier. One entry mentioned a collapsed engineering project that attempted to construct a hidden supply tunnel during a past decade. The project was abandoned due to repeated cave-ins and unreported injuries. After reading more, she realized the collapsed network sat directly beneath the exit she had traveled. She left the shelter with a deeper understanding of the hollow. The underground structure might have partially remained intact, which explained the vibrations and moving air currents. Yet the functioning beacons and shifting patterns suggested someone continued to monitor or access the network despite its unstable condition. Clara reported everything to regional authorities after reaching her lodge. Investigators visited the exit days later when the storm cleared. They found the snowmobile missing along with the abandoned maintenance trailer. Only scattered tools remained frozen into the ice. The pole with the empty winter suit had fallen into a drift, and the tracks near the service tunnel had vanished under fresh snow. Survey teams detected slight subsurface cavities below the hollow, which matched remnants of old industrial tunnels. They also documented faint metallic debris buried deep under compacted snow, which suggested past attempts to reinforce underground sections. No modern machinery was found, which left the source of the vibrations unresolved. Locals continued to warn travelers about that exit each winter. They claimed the hollow changed during storms. Some believed shifting pressure reopened parts of the underground network. Others thought an unknown group used the tunnels secretly during harsh weather. Travelers who ignored warnings sometimes reported lights moving in patterns along the valley floor, though no proof ever surfaced. Clara kept her distance from the exit after that night. She felt certain someone maintained parts of the collapsed network. The beacons and rhythmic tremors convinced her the hollow remained active during storms. The Winter Road exit still cuts through that valley and remains open each January, despite repeated warnings whispered in nearby towns where people remember the old project and the long, silent tunnels that still breathe beneath the project. Snow. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. Why this bridge is monitored every winter. The massive suspension bridge spanning the narrow canyon of the Iron River remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the northern range for over 60 years. A single automated structural sensor sat perched atop a weathered steel girder near the remote boundary of the central support tower. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the dangerous buildup of ice and snow on the suspension cables. Local maintenance officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant tremor or a major blizzard was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in December of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Caleb Vance was a 42-year-old structural technician who worked for the Regional Bridge Authority during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Caleb enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of reinforced steel. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated canyon crossing. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Caleb reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy ice storm. Caleb decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the camera. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the freezing rain or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray cables and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A dark maintenance van was parked on the narrow shoulder of the bridge just past the edge of the pedestrian walkway. The van had its hazard lights on, and the rear cargo door was left standing wide open toward the deep canyon below. It was an odd place to stop because the bridge was cleared of all work crews during the winter months. Caleb felt a slight chill because that section of the river crossing was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service coverage. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if a worker was standing near the vehicle for help. The dark van was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the edge. The figure appeared to be reaching over the metal railing, and they were pulling something heavy out from the deep shadows. Caleb zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty industrial trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a heavy insulated parka that obscured their identity from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third photo showed the dark van pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the slush. Caleb looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the snow was still flattened near the railing. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the safety barrier and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was freezing, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the massive steel cables. The ground was slick from the recent ice, and he noticed deep grooves in the frost where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 20 feet until he reached a small maintenance access hatch hidden behind a thicket of support beams. Caleb found the industrial trunk tucked under a pile of damp tarpaulins and heavy coils of wire that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Caleb immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the scene. He used his satellite radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item on the bridge. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Caleb to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model of the van. The officers noted that the vehicle did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the captured frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them on the bridge until the search died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the crossing to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the bridge camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the dark van. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the canyon. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret overseas purchase. One of the men was a former bridge inspector who knew exactly how to avoid the primary security monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote structural camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion detection. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. The archives of the Bridge Authority had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Caleb returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Iron River Bridge was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely spans. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel girder and records the passage of time 1 frame at a time. It captures the fog and the ice and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep canyon. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Caleb knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look for it. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might have caught. The bridge remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation into the museum theft revealed that the suspects had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the border. This operation would have stripped the region of its cultural history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Caleb received a formal commendation from the state governor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire mountain community. He often shares the story of the bridge camera with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence. The structural logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy steel beams. The quiet bridge stands over the river and continues to serve the travelers as it has for many decades. Visitors admire the architecture and the views of the canyon without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the walkway. The story of the structural sensor and the industrial trunk has become a local legend among the mountain residents. Most people walk past the steel tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional highway. For Caleb, the sound of the wind against the cables will always be a reminder of the hidden truths in the cold. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in December remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and police files. The people of the mountain valley continue their lives while the mystery of the bridge camera hangs over the canyon. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Caleb continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the bridge is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the Iron River is written in the steel and preserved in the digital logs. The Bridge Authority implemented new security protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Caleb is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all travelers. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Caleb knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look. The mystery of the canyon bridge is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Technicians now take a little more time to review the archives before they clear out the temporary storage on site. They look for the parked vans and the open doors and the figures moving through the shadows in the dark. The mountains keep many secrets, but they are becoming harder to hide from the ever-watchful digital eyes of the sensors. Caleb takes a final look at his laptop screen before he packs up his gear and heads back to the city. Everything is as it should be, and the system is functioning perfectly once again for the next 30 days of winter. He starts his truck and begins the long descent toward the valley while the mountain peaks fade in the mirror. The bridge is a lonely path through the wilderness, but it is no longer a place of hidden crimes and secrets. Every minute, a small click echoes from the top of the steel tower as a new image is captured. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The story of the bridge is over, but the watch over the canyon will never truly end. The missing tape found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timber line until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher, Marcus Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. The night shift report that ended an entire station. The coastal town of Blackwood Bay sat on the edge of a jagged peninsula where the Atlantic Ocean met the rocky shore. A small, automated weather station stood on the highest cliff to monitor the unpredictable wind patterns and rising tides of the northern coast. This station was a critical link for the local fishing fleet because it provided real-time data for navigation during the winter months. For 30 years, the facility operated without a single major incident until a Tuesday in November of 2022. On that night, the station recorded a sequence of data logs that defied every known atmospheric model used by the regional office. Elias Vance was a 48-year-old data analyst who worked for the Maritime Safety Division during that year. His primary job involved reviewing the nightly transmission reports to ensure the sensors remained calibrated against the shifting sea spray. Elias preferred the quiet of the late shift because it allowed him to focus on the subtle rhythms of the ocean sensors. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a decimal error in 1,000 lines of raw binary code. On that particular morning, he opened the final report from the Blackwood Bay unit and noticed something that felt fundamentally wrong. The report showed that at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind speed had dropped to 0 for 10 minutes. Elias knew this was physically impossible for a cliffside location that was constantly battered by the heavy ocean breeze. He checked the secondary sensors for the barometric pressure and saw that the readings had spiked to a record high. The temperature sensor recorded a sudden jump of 40 degrees within a matter of seconds before the entire system went dark. He reached for his coffee and leaned closer to the screen to examine the final archived frames from the lens. The first image showed the familiar view of the dark waves crashing against the base of the granite cliffs below. The second photo captured a strange, shimmering effect in the air that looked like heat rising from a summer pavement. In the third frame, the lens appeared to be melting from the outside in, as if it were exposed to fire. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach as he realized the station was not malfunctioning due to a software bug. He saw a faint shape in the center of the distortion that looked like a massive metallic hull hovering silently. He checked the internal diagnostic logs and found that the station had attempted to send a high-priority alert. The alert was titled as an unauthorized structural interference, and it had been triggered by an external magnetic pulse. Elias realized that the entire station had been physically neutralized by something that did not want to be tracked. He printed the logs and immediately called the director of the regional maritime office to report a critical failure. The director listened to the description of the melted hardware and ordered an immediate evacuation of the cliffside area. When the recovery team reached the site the next morning, they found the steel pole had been twisted like wire. The weather station housing was a blackened husk, and the solar panels had been shattered into thousands of tiny glass shards. There were no footprints in the mud and no signs of a physical explosion or a localized lightning strike. The investigators found a thin layer of iridescent dust covering the ruins of the equipment that vibrated with a low hum. They gathered samples of the dust and the warped metal to send to a specialized lab for further chemical analysis. The laboratory report confirmed that the metal had been subjected to a localized gravitational force of extreme intensity. The dust contained isotopes that were not consistent with any naturally occurring minerals found on the northern Atlantic coast. The official investigation concluded that a rare atmospheric phenomenon had caused a freak electrical discharge that destroyed the sensitive electronics. Elias read the final summary and knew that the researchers were simply trying to avoid a much larger conversation. He kept a digital copy of the original night shift report on an encrypted drive at his private home. The Maritime Safety Division decided to decommission the Blackwood Bay Station permanently after the incident was fully processed. They claimed the terrain was too unstable to support a new facility and moved the equipment to a safer harbor. The cliff remained empty, and the locals avoided the area because of the strange lights seen during the new moon. Elias retired from his position 6 months later and moved to a small cabin far away from the coast. He never spoke to the press about the melted lens or the silent hull in the final photograph. The night shift report remained a classified file that was buried deep within the archives of the Regional Safety Office. It served as a silent testimony to the moment a routine observation turned into a brush with the unknown. No one ever explained how a windless 10 minutes could lead to the complete physical erasure of a station. Elias often looks at the stars and wonders if the sensors are still recording things that people refuse to see. The ocean continues to roar against the cliffs, but the silence of that night still echoes in the data. The mystery of Blackwood Bay began to circulate among the small community of deep-sea fishermen and local lighthouse keepers. They spoke in hushed tones about the way the birds stopped singing in the hours leading up to the event. Old logs from 20 years prior suggested that similar magnetic anomalies had been recorded by merchant ships passing through the area. Elias spent his retirement cataloging these historical mentions and comparing them to the data on his encrypted drive. He found that every 12 years, the atmospheric pressure in the bay underwent a massive and unexplained shift. This pattern suggested that the event in 2022 was not an isolated incident of mechanical failure. It pointed toward a recurring presence that operated on a schedule far beyond the understanding of local authorities. The iridescent dust samples that Elias had secretly kept in a small glass vial began to glow faintly at night. He noticed that the vibrations from the dust would synchronize with the tide cycles of the distant Atlantic shore. This discovery led him to believe that whatever had destroyed the station was still present beneath the deep waves. The regional office eventually removed all mentions of the Blackwood Bay unit from their public-facing maps and websites. They replaced the data stream with a generic feed from a station located 40 miles further south in a harbor. This move ensured that the public would not notice the massive hole in the monitoring grid during the winter storms. Elias realized that the erasure of the station was a deliberate attempt to hide a truth that was too heavy. He continued to monitor the local radio frequencies from his cabin using a modified long-range antenna and a laptop. One night in late December, he picked up a signal that mirrored the frequency recorded during the final minutes of the station. The sound was a rhythmic pulsing that resembled a heartbeat transmitted through a thick layer of static and ocean noise. Elias recorded the signal and realized it was coming from the exact coordinates of the abandoned cliffside facility. He drove back to the coast one last time to see if anything had changed in the years since the event. The site was fenced off with heavy chain link and signs warning the public about unstable geological conditions. He stood by the fence and looked out toward the dark horizon, where the ocean met the sky in a line. The air felt heavy with the same static charge that he had seen in the photographs from the night shift report. A single light flickered far out at sea, where no buoy or ship was supposed to be stationed that evening. Elias knew that the story of the weather station was only the beginning of a much larger and darker narrative. He turned away from the cliff and drove back into the night, leaving the secrets of the bay behind. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in November remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and broken parts. The people of Blackwood Bay continue their lives while the phantom of the night shift report hangs over the coast. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the lens that are never meant to be understood by humans. Elias continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the ocean is never truly empty when the machines are the only ones left to listen. A dispatcher noticed an odd pattern during the blizzard. The winter of 1988 brought a storm that locals still talk about during every single heavy snow alert. Records from the county dispatch office show that emergency calls tripled within the first 4 hours of the whiteout conditions. Silas Vance was 42 years old and worked as a senior dispatcher for the rural Mountain Valley Emergency Services. He had spent 12 years answering phones, but nothing prepared him for the chaos of that specific Tuesday in January. Silas arrived at the station before dawn, while the first flakes were just beginning to cover the dark asphalt roads. His goal for the shift was simple, since he just wanted to keep the radio channels clear for the plows. The wind picked up around 10 o'clock, and visibility dropped to near zero across the entire northern half of the valley. The first strange call came through at noon from a woman who reported a stalled sedan on a back road. She told Silas that she saw a man in a red jacket walking away from the car toward the woods. Silas logged the location and sent a deputy, but the officer found the car was empty and completely locked up. The deputy reported that there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle despite what the witness had just claimed. Silas assumed the snow had simply filled the tracks in quickly because the wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. An hour later, another call arrived from a different part of the county regarding a man in a red jacket. This witness was an elderly farmer named Arthur, who claimed he saw someone standing in the middle of his field. Arthur said the figure was not moving at all despite the freezing temperatures and the blinding sheets of heavy snow. Silas checked the map and realized this farm was nearly 15 miles away from the first sighting of the sedan. It was impossible for someone to travel that distance on foot through a blizzard in such a short amount of time. The dispatcher began to feel a sense of unease as he looked at the blinking lights on his console screen. He decided to pull up the digital logs from the previous winter storms to see if this pattern had appeared. Dispatchers often share stories about ghost calls or strange sightings during heavy weather, but Silas usually ignored that kind of talk. He noticed a note in the archives from 1983 that mentioned a red jacket near a frozen creek bed. The similarities were enough to make him sit up straight and reach for his cold cup of black morning coffee. A third call interrupted his thoughts when a local gas station attendant reported a silent person standing by the pumps. The attendant described the individual as wearing a bright red coat that looked far too thin for the sub-zero weather. Silas asked the caller to approach the person, but the attendant refused because the stranger was behaving in a way. The person supposedly turned toward the shop window and just stared with an expression that the caller described as empty. When the deputy arrived 5 minutes later, the parking lot was empty and there were no signs of any visitors. Silas started plotting these points on a paper map of the valley to see if there was a physical connection. He used a red pen to mark the sedan, the farm, and the gas station while checking the exact times. The points formed a perfect straight line that cut across the most dangerous and uninhabited parts of the rugged mountain. This line did not follow any existing roads or hiking trails, which made the speed of the sightings even more. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows of the old dispatch center building office. He reached out to a retired dispatcher named Vance who had worked in the valley for over 35 years. Vance listened to the description of the red jacket and stayed silent on the other end of the phone line. The older man finally whispered that Silas should look at the logs from the Great Blizzard of 1972. Silas searched the basement archives and found a dusty folder containing handwritten notes from a very long night in December. He found a report about a missing surveyor who vanished while wearing a distinctive red parka during a record storm. The surveyor was named Elias, and he had been tasked with marking the boundary for a new high-voltage line. According to the old dispatch logs, Elias had sent a final radio transmission about getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Search teams looked for him for 3 weeks, but they never found a single trace of his gear or body. The line Silas had drawn on his map matched the exact path of the proposed power lines from that era. Every sighting from this afternoon was located at a spot where a massive steel utility tower currently stood in silence. Silas realized the figure was not walking between the locations, but was appearing at specific points along the electrical grid. He received one final call as the sun began to set behind the thick gray clouds of the dying storm. A homeowner near the end of the valley reported a man in a red jacket standing on her back porch. She said he was tapping on the glass and holding up a surveyor rod as if he were taking measurements. Silas told her to stay away from the windows and dispatched the nearest unit with a sense of urgent dread. The deputy reached the house in record time but found only a pile of snow leaning against the wooden door. There were no boots prints on the porch, and the homeowner was hiding in her bathroom with a loaded shotgun. Silas looked at his map one last time and saw the final point ended at the local main power substation. He called the utility company to warn them, but the technician said the gates were locked and the alarms silent. The storm finally broke around midnight, and the wind died down to a soft whistle through the frozen pine trees. Maintenance crews went out the following morning to clear the ice from the heavy lines near the primary mountain substation. They found a vintage surveyor rod leaning against the fence and a scrap of red fabric caught in the wire. There was no body found in the drifts, and no evidence that anyone had climbed over the high-security fence. Silas kept the scrap of fabric in his desk drawer as a reminder of the pattern he found that day. He never spoke about the red jacket again, but he always watched the monitors closely whenever the snow started falling. The valley remained quiet for the rest of the winter, and the strange calls did not return to the station. Experts say that sensory deprivation during blizzards can cause groups of people to imagine similar things out of thin air. Silas knew the difference between a tired mind and a factual log of events recorded in real time on paper. He retired 3 years later and moved to a coastal town where it never snows and the sun always shines. The records of 1988 remain in the basement for the next person who might notice the strange pattern. The county museum eventually displayed a small exhibit about the surveyor who disappeared so many long decades ago in the cold. Visitors often stop to read the official reports from that night, and they wonder about the man in the red coat. Some believe that the energy from the high voltage lines acted as a conduit for a soul lost in time. Others think that the extreme weather simply bends reality in ways that the human mind cannot ever fully understand or explain. The dispatch office still uses the same map system, but the younger workers do not know about the red ink. Silas spent his final days sitting on a porch by the ocean while reading books about geography and local mountain history. He often thought about the surveyor Elias and hoped the man finally found the boundaries he was looking for that night. The red fabric in his drawer eventually faded to a dull pink, but the memory of the tapping glass remained. He knew that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police officers or by professional search and rescue teams. The blizzard of 1988 remains a legend that grows larger every time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The station logs were digitized in the year 2010, but some of the original handwritten notes were lost during the process. Silas had made sure to photocopy the most important pages before he left the valley for the very last time ever. He sent those copies to a historical society so that the truth of the pattern would not be forgotten by history. The surveyor rod found at the substation remains in a glass case as a silent witness to a very strange afternoon. No one has seen the man in the red jacket since the power grid was upgraded in the early 90s. The wind still howls through the mountain passes, and the snow still buries the small towns under feet of frozen white powder. Every dispatcher who sits at that desk now hears the faint static on the radio during the height of a storm. They look at the screens and they watch for any calls about a man walking alone where no man should be. The legacy of the red jacket is a part of the valley now, and it will be for a long time. Silas Vance died peacefully, knowing that he had documented the impossible with the steady hand of a true professional worker. This 911 call from January was never meant to air. The release of a redacted audio file from a county emergency database revealed a series of events that the local sheriff department had originally classified as a closed case. A public records advocate discovered the recording while searching for unrelated traffic logs from the early weeks of the winter season last year. The audio was remarkably clear and captured the final moments of a lone driver who had stopped at an isolated mountain rest area. It contained a sequence of frantic reports that suggested something was stalking the caller from the frozen shadows of the pine forest. Harlan Vance was a 50-year-old industrial mechanic who spent his weeks driving to various remote manufacturing plant sites for urgent repairs. He arrived at the gravel turnout near the state forest boundary early on a Thursday night to check a strange sound in his engine. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year, and Harlan expected to finish his inspection before the midnight snow began to fall. He carried a heavy-duty wrench and a high-powered flashlight to examine the undercarriage of his large silver transport truck. The highway was silent, and the air felt heavy with the scent of pine needles and cold mountain air during that night. As Harlan walked around the rear of his trailer, he noticed a series of strange markings etched into the frozen asphalt near his tires. He followed the trail of dark residue with his light until he reached the edge of the dense and silent tree line. The internal logs of the dispatch center recorded him placing a call at exactly 11:45 in the evening of January 12th. Harlan reported that he saw a group of tall figures standing perfectly still just beyond the reach of his high beams. He returned to the cab and locked the doors before realizing that his radio was emitting a very loud and steady hum. He sat in the driver's seat, and the audio recording captured a strange clicking sound that seemed to be growing in volume. A thick layer of white frost began to form on the interior windshield, even though the desert air was quite warm before. Harlan reached for his handset to tell the operator that the figures were now moving toward the front of the heavy truck. The dispatcher reportedly heard him explaining that the figures did not have any visible faces or any discernible human features at all. His voice was shaky and suggested that Harlan was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation and intense primal fear. According to local archives, the area where Harlan parked had been the site of several unexplained events since 1961. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing lights that moved in strange patterns over the high ridges. Search teams arrived at the gravel turnout 3 days after Harlan was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck with the engine still running and the headlights on, but the driver was completely gone from the cab. Harlan left his flashlight on the ground, and it was the only piece of gear that showed signs of extreme heat. The mechanic had decided to keep the line open, even when the dispatcher told him to stay inside the vehicle and wait. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life describing a bright blue glow that was filling the entire forest. Harlan felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to see the source of light. He walked toward the trees and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking sound grew much louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the call back at the county station several long months later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a heavy latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any normal human hiker. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a light approaching the truck. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden by the clouds. Witness statements from 2023 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in that specific sector. Harlan Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking moved much closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the turnout that Tuesday night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the side of the silver truck. Harlan stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange mechanism. The mechanic whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the turnout would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Harlan Vance had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep and hidden canyon. However, the details on the dispatch recording suggested that the mechanic was being actively hunted by something very strange and old. The sheriff paused the audio and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the call ended at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched a human heartbeat perfectly. The sound was sharp and sounded like bones striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver transport truck. The final few seconds of the call contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the truck window from outside. Harlan shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the cold air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the old ranger station he saw earlier that day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the line going dead forever. Silence filled the room of the station as the audio stopped without any more words from the lost mechanic. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the archived call file. A technician named Marcus Reed examined the digital files and confirmed that the audio had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the turnout together to look for the ranger station Harlan mentioned in his words. The woods seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the dirt that contained a series of sketches and a ring. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the forest floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Marcus noted that the silver ring had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Harlan Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that was very ancient. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle today. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dispatch recording remains in a high-security evidence locker at the office. The family of Harlan Vance often thinks about the quiet mechanic and the warning he tried to leave behind then. The audio serves as a haunting reminder that the forest holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by the living world. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind tonight. The turnout remains empty and avoided by locals, but the recording still holds the final warning of the night. Every time Marcus drives past that specific mile marker on the highway, he remembers the frantic voice on the tape. He kept a photocopy of the report in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to read it. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the ring. Local legends continue to grow about the unmarked turnout and the blue lights that still appear in the deep woods. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the limestone, where the vibrations never truly stopped moving there. The county records indicate that several other calls were placed from the same area during the following weeks of January. Each caller described a similar sensation of being watched by something that could not be seen in the direct light. One woman reported that her car engine died at the same spot and she heard the clicking sound for hours. She managed to restart her vehicle and flee, but she refuses to drive that stretch of road after the sunset. The patterns in the calls suggest that the phenomenon is tied to the lunar cycle and the forest density. The sheriff has since ordered a permanent closure of the gravel turnout to prevent any more travelers from stopping there. There are no signs explaining the decision, but the heavy concrete barriers send a clear message to stay away now. Marcus Reed believes that the signals recorded on the 911 call were not meant for human ears to understand today. He suggests that the clicking was a form of data transmission between the figures and the craft in the sky. The silver ring remains the only physical link to a world that exists just beyond our own perception. The story of the call that was never meant to air has become a cautionary tale for the local dispatchers. They are taught to recognize the specific signs of electronic interference and the sound of the rhythmic clicking in the background. If a caller reports a blue light in the forest, the operators are instructed to tell them to drive fast. The mountains keep their secrets well, but occasionally a recording escapes the archives to tell us the truth about the plan. We are all just travelers on a road that is far more mysterious than we can ever truly imagine. Harlan Vance is a name that will be remembered by those who have heard the frantic urgency in his final. His voice serves as a bridge between the mundane world and the unknown that waits in the shadows of January. We listen to the static on the old radio bands, and we wonder if he is still calling out. The light is beautiful, but it carries a price that most people are not willing to pay in the be careful where you choose to stop when the sun goes down and the forest starts to speak tonight. The mystery of the mountain pass is a burden that the sheriff carries with him every single day he works. He knows that the 911 call was just one small part of a much larger story involving the lights. The archived audio will remain in the dark until someone else is brave enough to listen to the final clicks. We are not alone in the wilderness, and the recordings prove that some things are better left in silence. Stay on the road and keep your eyes moving, because the shadows are always watching the travelers in the Tointine. Park rangers were told never to open this gate. The presence of a rusted steel gate deep within the national forest remains one of the most persistent mysteries among the local maintenance crews. This barrier stands at the end of a forgotten access road that the Park Service stopped maintaining over 40 years ago for unknown reasons. Senior rangers often pass down a verbal warning to every new recruit that the lock on the chain must never be cut or replaced. The gate is marked with a simple sign that says authorized personnel only, but no official record exists of what lies on the other side. Silas Vance was a 39-year-old trail maintenance supervisor who spent his decade of service repairing the remote backcountry paths. He arrived at the northern boundary line early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of clearing the fallen timber from the winter storms. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his clearing work before the heavy fog arrived. He carried a heavy-duty chainsaw and a metal detector to locate any buried survey markers that might have shifted during the recent mudslides. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp moss and old cedar wood that had started to rot. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of mountain laurel, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of an old asphalt road. He followed the cracked pavement until he saw the silhouette of a heavy black gate that was chained shut with a thick iron lock. The metal was pitted with deep rust, and the surrounding trees had started to grow through the bars of the structure over the many years. Silas stepped toward the barrier and felt the ground vibrate slightly as a low humming sound echoed from the dark valley beyond the hills. He noticed that the chain was cold to the touch and the lock appeared to be fused together by some kind of intense heat. He pushed the gate and noticed a strange scent of ozone and sulfur hanging heavy in the air on the other side of the road. A thick layer of white ash covered the ground and every surface, but the trees beyond the gate looked surprisingly vibrant and healthy. Silas approached a small stone building that sat 50 yards past the entrance and saw a series of radio antennas pointing toward the sky. He found a small wooden box resting beside the front door with a handwritten label that simply said, "Do not enter under any circumstances." The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a person who was working under a great deal of stress. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific sector was a man named Elias Thorne in 1978. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his radio checks after reporting a series of bright lights over the ridgeline. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing ranger or his Park Service vehicle at all. Silas picked up the wooden box and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire abandoned station area. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man who was told to guard this gate. The supervisor decided to bring the box back to his truck to see if the contents contained any clues about the missing ranger. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back through the dense brush while the sun began to dip below the sharp mountain peaks. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to open the container and discover why the area had been kept secret for so many decades. He drove back to the main station in silence and immediately began searching for any historical maps of the northern boundary sector. The station was quiet as he sat at his desk and noticed the flickering fluorescent lights reflecting off the metal surface of the box. Silas eventually found a small key inside the desk drawer and used it to pry open the lid of the wooden container that evening. He pulled out a small leather journal and began to read the first entry by the light of his small desk lamp. A voice in his head seemed to form as he read about a series of metallic objects appearing in the valley behind the gate. The man in the journal claimed that the objects were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft or military technology. He wrote with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer who was familiar with the typical wildlife of the mountains. The narrator described how the metallic objects would hover over the peaks for hours before disappearing into the deep granite caves that lined the valley walls. Witness statements from 1978 mention similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same late summer month. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the ground beneath the black steel gate every single night. He believed that something was living deep inside the mountain and was using the radio antennas to signal others out in the dark sky. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass lenses of his binoculars to shatter in his hands while he watched. Silas read closely as the journal captured the description of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the small stone observation building. Elias stopped writing for several hours, and the next entry was a frantic scrawl that was almost impossible to read in the dim light. The ranger wrote that he could see tall figures moving through the trees without making any sound or breaking any of the dry branches. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for him to open the gate so they could move their equipment further into the forest. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the roof of the cabin with a very terrifying and fluid speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from a mental break and wandered into the ravine. However, the details in the journal suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his life and the park. Silas paused his reading and looked at the date on the final page, which was the night before Elias Thorne vanished from the forest. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the description of the thumping in the journal matched a sound he heard. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the heavy chain of the black gate back at the northern boundary. The final few paragraphs of the journal contained a frantic description of the valley being filled with a bright and blinding blue light. Elias shouted through his pen that the humming sound was vibrating his bones and making his vision blur from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to lock the wooden box and hide it near the door before the figures reached the station. The writing ended abruptly with a long ink smear across the page and the sound of a heavy metallic crash recorded in his memory. Silence filled the office of Silas as he closed the journal and looked out at the dark and empty forest in the distance. Silas contacted the regional director the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the wooden box near the hidden gate. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the journal and confirmed that the paper and ink matched the official supplies used in 1978. They returned to the site of the gate together to look for the Park Service vehicle that Elias Thorne had been driving that year. The woods seemed different under the gray morning light, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal tag buried in the dirt that contained the serial number of the missing truck and a silver ring. The blueprints of the area showed detailed diagrams of a tunnel system that extended several miles beneath the mountain and into the restricted valley sector. One image captured a large circular structure that was not part of any original Park Service engineering plans for the northern boundary or roads. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any known human language or culture. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply walked away, but had been taken into a place that existed far beneath the mountain peaks. The symbols on the ring began to glow with a soft light when the men brought it near the gate. The authorities sealed the road leading to the northern boundary with a thick layer of concrete and new warning signs to prevent any trespassing. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for anyone who found the box. The journal serves as a haunting reminder that some gates are kept locked for a very specific and dark reason that we may never understand. He no longer works on the backcountry trails because the low humming sound still echoes in his ears whenever the forest gets too quiet. The gate remains locked and forgotten by the public, but the forest still holds the secret of what happened in 1978. Every time Silas looks at the northern ridge, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost ranger named Elias Thorne in that old journal. He kept a photocopy of the pages in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to look at the final ink smear again. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring or the symbols. Local legends continue to grow about the locked gate and the blue lights that still appear over the peaks during the summer. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the granite, where the vibrations never truly stopped moving through the mountain and trees. In this new story, archived incident logs mention a remote ranger station where the final recorded footage surfaced during a massive January blizzard that cut power across several mountain routes. The footage appeared normal at first, yet investigators noted abrupt audio distortions moments before the feed ended. Locals still mention the event when storms roll through that region. Darren Morrow, a 38-year-old seasonal ranger, arrived at the station shortly after noon to prepare for worsening conditions. His assignment involved monitoring trail beacons and checking radio towers before the storm blocked access. He expected a long shift because the blizzard warning described unusually fast-moving cloud bands capable of burying vehicles within minutes. He carried a thermos of coffee, his logbook, and an old camcorder used for final checks before each closure. Snowfall increased as he hiked the short path leading to the outpost. The cabin-sized station stood on a ridge overlooking a frozen valley. Wind pushed against its wooden frame, which creaked with each gust. He unlocked the door, then stepped inside while his boots scattered snow across the floorboards. The air felt colder than usual, which suggested the old furnace struggled to keep up with incoming wind. He wrote a note about adding extra insulation during the next supply run. Darren began recording a standard check-in message for the regional office. The camcorder rested on a small tripod that faced the desk and radio console. As he spoke, he heard faint rattling outside, which might have been ice sliding off the roof. The footage captured him turning toward the window briefly before returning to his report. He mentioned the storm pattern shifting earlier than forecast, which matched updates from nearby stations. After finishing the recording, he stepped outside to secure loose items, since strong gusts sometimes pulled equipment down the slope. He fastened the shutters, tightened the fuel drums, and checked the tower base for cracks caused by freezing moisture. The wind cut at his jacket, which forced him to work quickly. Far below, he noticed faint lights flickering along the tree line. He assumed the lights came from hikers rushing toward shelter despite posted warnings. He tried raising nearby patrol teams on the radio, yet static overwhelmed the signal. He switched frequencies and heard fragmented voices that cut out mid-sentence. He made a note in his log about interference likely caused by atmospheric distortion. Snow began falling sideways, which signaled the blizzard center approaching faster than predicted. He retreated to the station as visibility worsened until the valley vanished behind gray walls of wind. Inside, he sealed the door and activated the exterior floodlights. The beams barely pierced the storm, yet illuminated swirling sheets of snow. The camcorder still rested on the desk, which blinked with a low battery warning. He replaced the battery, then recorded another clip describing the radio disruption and increasing wind speed. Midway through the message, the cabin door rattled sharply as if someone pushed from outside. Darren grabbed his flashlight and approached the door cautiously. He called anyone out there, but the blizzard swallowed his voice. He opened the door slightly, though the wind forced it against him. A shadow shifted near the propane tank, then vanished behind a curtain of drifting snow. He scanned the area for movement, but saw only storm waves rolling across the ridge. He closed the door firmly and logged the incident because shadows near the tank often meant wildlife searching for warmth. Minutes later, the radio crackled with a distorted tone, followed by a faint voice repeating the word northbound. The message sounded strained and clipped, as if the speaker were fighting heavy wind. Darren responded but heard no reply. He adjusted the range and tried again until only static filled the room. The camcorder recorded him staring at the console while the wind shook the building steadily. He stepped away to check the furnace since the temperature dropped several degrees. The old system clattered like metal plates shifting under strain. He opened the access panel and tapped the ductwork lightly, which helped clear condensation. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards, which made him pause. The vibration felt steady and too uniform for random wind. He checked beneath the sink and along the support beams for structural shifts, but found nothing. Outside, the floodlights flickered as if something obstructed them. The storm intensified, which caused the beams to pulse irregularly. He approached the window and saw brief flashes of orange light along the ridge. The lights moved in a slow pattern like markers following a path through the blizzard. He whispered, "No one should be out there," because the route near the ridge closed hours earlier. Darren put on his gear and stepped outside despite the punishing wind. He moved a few feet from the cabin before the storm nearly pushed him sideways. He braced himself against the railing and scanned the ridge for the orange lights, yet they faded instantly. Snow whipped across his face in dense sheets, which forced him to retreat inside. He shook off ice and placed his gloves near the furnace to thaw. The camcorder recorded him pacing between the window and radio console. The audio captured faint thumps from the roof, which sounded heavier than falling ice. He grabbed a long-handled broom and tapped the ceiling in several spots to dislodge buildup. More thumps echoed, which made him lower the broom slowly. He wrote another entry in his log describing rhythmic impacts not caused by tree limbs or loose panels. Storm pressure increased until the station walls groaned steadily. The camcorder captured a brief flicker of the lights, followed by darkness. Emergency lanterns activated automatically, which cast the room in a dim amber glow. The radio emitted a harsh frequency spike, then cut off completely. Darren pulled the backup receiver from a metal case and attempted contact again, yet no channels reached through the storm. A sharp knock hit the door, which startled him enough to step back. He called, "Identify yourself," yet only the wind answered. He approached the peephole and saw nothing except swirling white. When he unlatched the top bolt, a second, harder strike hit the frame. He shut the bolt quickly while breathing heavily. He checked the window, yet the ridge remained invisible within the storm. He reviewed the exterior camera feed connected to a small monitor near the desk. The screen showed distorted snow patterns and brief static bursts. He switched angles until one camera displayed a dark shape hovering near the propane tank. The shape moved out of frame before the feed failed entirely. He reached for his coat again, but decided against stepping outside after remembering the collapsing visibility. The floor vibrated once more as if heavy machinery operated underground. The station had no subterranean structures, which made the sensation more concerning. He steadied himself while writing in the log about the vibration lasting longer than earlier ones. The camcorder captured the moment the station lights flickered again, while a faint metallic hum filled the room. Darren turned toward the window when a sudden flash illuminated the ridge. The flash looked like a flare, yet burned too quickly to match standard emergency equipment. He moved closer until the vibration intensified. Snow along the windowsill shook loose, which signaled a stronger tremor under the cabin. He grabbed the radio microphone and attempted one final call. The transmission failed mid-sentence, which caused the radio to emit a shrill tone. The camcorder picked up the moment he dropped the microphone and reached for the breaker panel. He reset the switches, though the storm overpowered the system instantly. He shut the panel and stepped back when the knock returned to the door with a deep, hollow sound. He called out again, but received no reply. His voice cracked with fear, which rarely happened during his long years at remote posts. He prepared to secure the shutters when the propane tank outside let out a sharp pop caused by sudden pressure change. He rushed to the window, yet could not see through the frozen glass. He scraped frost away and saw faint movement near the tank, but the blizzard distorted everything into shapes he could not identify. The camcorder recorded the room shaking twice before a heavy impact landed against the wall facing the ridge. The lanterns wavered as another vibration traveled through the floor. Darren grabbed the emergency flare gun and aimed it at the door, even though firing inside would be dangerous. He backed toward the desk while keeping his eyes on the entrance. A final burst of wind slammed against the station, which caused the camcorder tripod to wobble. The camera tilted slightly as Darren shouted something partly drowned by the storm. The feed captured one last frame of him turning toward the window when a brilliant light filled the room for a split second. The video ended abruptly as the camera lost power. Rescue teams reached the station 2 days later after the blizzard subsided. They found the structure partially buried and the door forced inward by snow pressure. Darren's gear remained inside, yet he was missing. The propane tank showed signs of rapid freezing, then sudden expansion. Survey crews noted unusual ground disturbances near the ridge, though no modern machinery was found. Authorities recovered the camcorder near the desk, where it had fallen during the final minutes. Forensic review confirmed no tampering and no clear explanation for the final light captured on the feed. Audio analysis detected low-frequency vibrations matching subsoil shifts often recorded near unstable terrain, though the ridge showed no signs of collapse. Locals believe the ridge amplifies storm pressure, which creates strange lights and sounds. Some claim older tunnels exist beneath the station, built during a forgotten project, though no records confirm their purpose. Others think the flashes are atmospheric arcs triggered by intense blizzard conditions. Darren's disappearance remains an unsolved entry in the regional archive. Each January, rangers at nearby posts mention hearing faint vibrations during heavy storms. They sometimes report flickering lights near the ridge, which vanish before verification. The station still stands as a supply shelter, though it remains unstaffed during deep winter. Footage from that final night remains part of training sessions for new rangers. In those recordings, Darren's voice grows strained as each vibration grows stronger. The storm outside presses against the walls like a living presence. The video ends before any clear answer appears, which leaves viewers with the same uncertainty investigators faced. Snow still buries the ridge each winter. Wind still carves deep whirls near the outpost. Travelers who pass through the area during storms sometimes hear faint knocking carried through the cold air. Most dismiss the sound as shifting ice, though a few believe the ridge holds more than wind and snow. They mention Darren's final footage, which captures a moment where something pressed close to the station during a blizzard that erased nearly all visibility except for one last flash that no one has ever explained. What happened inside this winter motel still haunts police. The discovery of a frozen guest log beneath the floorboards of a demolished building changed the history of a small town. A construction worker found the leather book while clearing debris from a winter motel that had been closed for decades. The pages were damp, but the ink remained legible enough to reveal a series of names that never officially checked out. It contained a final entry from a traveler who seemed to document a very strange event before vanishing into the night. Silas Vance was a 45-year-old insurance investigator who spent his days traveling between the quiet and snowy towns. He arrived at the motel early on a Tuesday evening with the simple goal of resting before his morning meeting. The weather was unusually cold for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his paperwork in the warm room. He carried a heavy briefcase and a small portable radio to keep him company during the long and silent winter night. The air was dry, and the building felt heavy with the scent of old carpet and stale smoke that lingered. As Silas parked his car in front of room 12, he noticed a series of strange markings on the doorframe. He followed the grain of the wood with his fingers until he felt a deep vibration coming from the door. The investigator stepped inside the room and noticed that the furniture was arranged in a pattern that made no sense. He moved toward the desk and found a small handwritten note tucked under the base of the plastic bedside lamp. The note was dated August 10, 1972, and it warned the reader not to turn off the lights. He sat on the bed, and the internal silence of the room was broken by a soft humming from the walls. A thick layer of frost began to form on the window, even though the heater was running at full power. Silas reached for his radio to find a music station, but only a rhythmic clicking came through the small speaker. He found a ledger in the drawer and noticed that the last guest had written about a shadow in corner. The handwriting was jagged and suggested that the person was feeling a sudden sense of physical dread or deep fear. According to local archives, the area where the motel stood had been the site of several missing person cases before. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple guests reported seeing figures that stood perfectly still in the parking lot. Search teams arrived at the property 4 days after Silas was reported missing, but found no signs of any struggle. They found his car parked in the exact same spot, but the interior was filled with a fine white sand. Silas left his briefcase on the bed, and it was the only piece of property that had a note. The investigator had decided to keep a log of the sounds he heard through the thin walls of the unit. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded time staring at the door while the clicking sound grew louder. Silas felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped toward the bathroom to investigate a bright light under the door. He walked toward the glowing crack and disappeared from the main room as the humming reached a very high pitch. The town was quiet when the developers finally found the hidden ledger during the demolition process many long years later. The authorities eventually found a working player and listened to the final 30 minutes of the tape Silas had made. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the snow. The figure in the room moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of a human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn the next guest about the light. The recording described how a large shadow would move across the ceiling, even when the lamp was turned toward wall. Witness statements from 1972 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of travelers in the same sector. Silas Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his head as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the room that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the mirror to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the exterior bricks of motel. Silas stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The investigator whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the outdoor sign. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the power to fail so the room would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the windows up to the roof with a very terrifying mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Silas Vance had originally concluded that he likely walked into the snow and lost. However, the details in the ledger suggested that the investigator was being actively watched by something that understood his routine. The sheriff paused the tape and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the recording stopped at exactly midnight. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the tape matched the rhythm of breathing. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the wooden frame of the door in the room. The final few seconds of the audio contained a frantic description of the room being filled with a blue light. Silas shouted that the humming sound was vibrating his teeth and making his ears bleed from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the ledger so that someone would eventually find the truth. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the radio being crushed shut. Silence filled the room of the station as the tape stopped without any more images of the desert or... The sheriff contacted the state archives the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the motel site. A technician named Marcus Reed examined the ledger and confirmed that the ink matched the supplies used in '72. They returned to the site of the ruins together to look for the briefcase Silas mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the foundation that contained a series of sketches and a watch. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the motel roof. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of room 12 with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Marcus noted that the silver watch had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light. They realized that Silas Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that was very ancient. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the ledger remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Silas Vance often thinks about the quiet investigator and the warning he tried to leave behind. The book serves as a haunting reminder that the winter holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by the living. He no longer explores the old roadside buildings because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his. The site remains empty and avoided by locals, but the ledger still holds the final warning of 1970. Every time Marcus drives past the empty lot, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost man on the page. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read. The researcher, Marcus Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver watch again. Local legends continue to grow about the motel room and the lights that still appear over the snow floor. Silas knew that the truth was recorded on that small ledger hidden under the boards of the old room. Today, the highway is monitored by new systems that do not require a man to stop at a motel today. The lot is covered with winter snow, and the state has removed the old signs from the high desert sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the city where the lights keep the shadows away from the windows. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the tape was a message or just the sound. The winter wind continues to blow snow against the ruins, while the memory of the investigator fades into local history. The road goes on forever, but some travelers never reach the end of the line because of the motel lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high winter night. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes recorded. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why his voice stays in the ledger where the words never truly fade. The snow is waiting for the next traveler to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. The archived records of the local police department show that the original investigators were deeply unsettled by the evidence found. Many of them resigned within a year of the search and refused to speak about the details of Room 12. They reportedly felt a lingering coldness that no amount of heating could fix, even in the middle of the summer. The case of Silas Vance remains one of the most chilling, unexplained mysteries in the history of the mountain pass. His voice on the tape continues to remind us that some winter nights are far longer than the calendar says.